My name is Sebastian Bostwick, and I'm an MFA candidate in poetry here at University of Notre Dame. And I'm joined with the wonderful Oliver Baez Bendorf. Baez, sorry, I should have asked that first. Who I will be interviewing today for the Institute for Latino Studies Oral History Project. Today's date is November 7th. It is, in 2019, it's around 2:30 p.m. And we're currently in the Scholars Lounge in Bond Hall in the University of Notre Dame's campus in South Bend, Indiana. So I already mentioned this, but we kind of just start off like a background information, like where and when you were born, any family history, significant childhood memories, moments that inspired you to pursue writing, things like that, so you can get a little sketch of who you are as a person and a poet.
Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot.
Okay, yeah, let me see here. I'll start with some basics, which I'm pretty sure to be true. I was born in Iowa City, Iowa, on June 21st, 1987. Gemini Cancer cusp, for the record.
Love that.
And let's see, I lived in Iowa City until my 21st birthday. My father grew up in Iowa, and my mother grew up in Chicago, and then had gone a few hours west to the University of Iowa, which is where they met. And they met on the first day of freshman writing at the University of Iowa. I have one older sister, and my favorite chore was taking out the compost. My parents always had a big garden, and I would take out the compost, which we kept in like an old gallon ice cream container. And I hated that part because it was, it smelled, and but I liked staying out there and just gorging myself on raspberries from the garden. So I'd be like, take out the compost, and then half an hour later.
Still be out there.
Yeah. I drew a lot. I was very obsessed with song lyrics, and as soon as the internet came around, I would look up song lyrics for songs that I had heard on the radio or things like that and print them out and just carry them with me everywhere and memorize them. Looking back now, I can see the ways that lyrics were a portal to poetry for me, because at some point the music part of it sort of dropped off, and I started writing my own song lyrics that just sort of, I can track it to poetry, even though at the time I was like, these are song lyrics. We always had dogs. There were some fish and lizards around. And my father's family was part of the Amana colonies in Iowa, which was a communal living situation that was one of the longest lasting and one of the largest in the United States. And they were communal from about 1855 to around 1930 in Iowa. And that was a group that had started in Germany, although it also included some French and some others, and they were a group of mystics, and they were persecuted in Germany because they wanted to homeschool their kids, and were conscientious objectors and all of these things, and didn't believe in signing oaths. So they came here, and my mother's father grew up in Puerto Rico, was born there. He now lives in Florida. And my mother's mother was Southern Italian, and her family fled Italy during Mussolini and went first to Montreal and then to Chicago. So that's some family history. That's some childhood memories, some pet information. If there's anything else, feel free to ask on that one or others.
Yeah, and you touched on what kind of led you to poetry. Well, I wanted to ask about that, actually. So you would write your own lyrics. Did you play instruments at all, or was it just you kind of were just oh, will be set to music eventually?
I did play instruments at a certain point. So I played trumpet for 1 year in the school band, and my parents had the foresight to only rent the instrument. And then I played guitar. My dad had a guitar, and he taught me some things, and so that was really when it was like, I am writing song lyrics to be played with guitar.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't very good at guitar, and I dropped that off at some point after playing a few of my songs at open mics in town. And so that was when the lyric writing sort of kept going. It wasn't really until college when I took a class that I was like, oh, this is poetry, or a version of it is poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And then just one more thing about that is
Mm-hmm.
And I know you are in Kalamazoo, right? So you're teaching there.
Yep.
Yeah. A little bit about that experience.
Yeah. This is my second year teaching at Kalamazoo College in Michigan, which is just about an hour and a half north of where we are right now. And I'm an assistant professor there. I teach creative writing and poetry. And before that, I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is also where I went to graduate school. So.
And I saw online you learned to be a librarian there.
I did.
So
I
fun.
got my MFA in poetry, and then, I had applied to some post-MFA fellowships, and I was a finalist for one, and I didn't get any, and I didn't have any idea what else I was going to do. But during my MFA, I had started working part-time at a library on campus, and I had already kind of been thinking, maybe this someday, because I had been working with this incredible collection of mostly modernist literary journals, but the collection was still had active subscriptions to contemporary journals as well. And it was amazing, it was like having subscriptions to, so I thought that was really cool, and I started to get interested in librarianship, and so I just decided at that point to do that sort of right after my MFA. So I did that, and I kept working at the library on campus, and I guess it started kind of as a backup, but I don't mean that as anything about I mean, it was great, and I think of it as sort of, it shapes a lot of the ways that I teach now, and so, yeah.
That's awesome. I had never heard of, I guess, I just never thought about it. It's like one of those jobs you never really think about you get trained for.
Yeah.
Like different things, and I've been around libraries and librarians my whole life.
Yeah, librarians are amazing. Audre Lorde was a librarian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can go to another question. I was thinking we could maybe talk about if there's any specific models or poets that influenced your work at all, or I know you've talked about before, and I did a little bit of interview research.
Yeah.
Of past professors who. I think Lydia Berry or something.
Linda Berry.
Linda Berry.
Yep. So, as far as I think about my influences as a poet as rather eclectic, which I love. And sometimes I get jealous of, if there's a poet that's like, I'm of the lineage of this one poet in particular, because it's so clear, and it isn't that clear for me. But, I read omnivorously and also deeply. And I feel blessed to have had some really amazing teachers in my life. My first poetry teacher was at the University of Iowa when I was an undergrad, and her name was Caroline Manring. She lives in the Finger Lakes region of New York now, teaches there, and she was a graduate student in the Iowa Writers Workshop at the time, and introduced me to Elizabeth Bishop and Scansion and Ammons and anaphora. I mean, so many of it. I still think back on that class all the time when I'm teaching. Let's see, others at Wisconsin. I mean, taking a workshop with Linda Berry was a peak pinnacle moment for me, and I took her workshop in the last semester of my MFA in poetry there. She's not in the creative writing program there, although a lot of writers will take workshops with her. She's got this amazing title that's like Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Creativity, which I love. And the workshop that I took with her was about like creativity and the brain. So we all got assigned different parts of the brain names. I was amygdala for the semester. And man, it was amazing. You and I were talking earlier about teaching, outside of our genre. And one thing that was really intimidating for me when I started to teach, actually, and this isn't even genre specific, it was like, the week on imagery, like the week on the image. And I was teaching it, and I was at the same time that I was trying to teach it, like, what even is this thing, Like and so taking her workshop where we were like about like memories and imagination, and we were also actually physically drawing a lot. And that just changed everything about the way that I taught the image, the way I think about the image, the way that I work it in my own writing. I was really just seeing it on a spectrum of like the literal image that is in a drawing. And also not just the visual, but those details that seem so dumb and are like a portal to an entire like life or an entire like part of your life. It's like the smell that like holds the key to something, or so that workshop, it's hard to even put it into words, and it just changed everything. Teaching and writing and drawing, and Linda became a really important mentor and friend to me, and I just feel so lucky and blessed to have found my way to that workshop. And all of the faculty at Wisconsin, I felt like I don't know what I did to deserve it, but that place was really good to me. And Ahmad Jamal Johnson continues to be a mentor there. Jonathan Senshin, who became a mentor to me in library school, and also had kind of come from like a literature background into the library school. So eclectic influences at times. It's just like an individual poem, like one of there's a Pablo Neruda poem right now that is like my teacher this week. Comes from all over.
Yeah, I feel like that shows up a lot because I feel like you experiment lots with different forms and different like movements happening in all of your. Well, I guess with the chapbook it's mostly like the prose poem, but with the other ones it's very, I don't know. I feel like that shows up and it's a good amalgamation of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But one thing that does come up in all of your writing is nature, of course. But and specifically like Midwest landscape, like there's lots of cornfields, farmland, and like specific names that are mentioned, and then that ascribe like a sacredness to the land and to the space around us. And I'm curious if there are other like maybe less overt influences that like nature has on like just like your writing process itself, or how you see your poetry in relation to nature.
Yeah, I think this has shifted over the years for me and continues to shift, but I mean, like I was telling you, like my favorite thing as a kid was like when I would just get to go hang out in the garden alone. And I was a lonely kid. I was a weird kid. I felt very different from like most of the other kids around me. And one thing that I really am grateful to my parents for was that was just we spent a lot of time outside and like cultivate like the outdoor space was like an extension of our home. My dad is a very talented and serious birder, and so that sort of like observation I feel like I got kind of as osmosis growing up, and I also like am prone to anxiety, and when I can remember that just like going outside, like sticking my feet in the dirt, or even just like opening a window or something that like brings it back down into the body and like connects in that way, it's a nice thing for me. So there's sort of that element, and then there's also in advantages of being evergreen, like it was great solace to sort of feel like there were days when it could feel like, oh, like literally no one around me is changing right now, which is of course not true and bogus, but it can just, there's a kind of like awkwardness to it, or at least like having a second puberty when like literally none of your peers are.
Yep.
And so it delighted and comforted me to just feel and cultivate a kind of like solidarity with actually the amazing like transformations that are happening all around us all the time. Mm-hmm. And as in recent work, also, I'm kind of trying to think through a little bit more explicitly the connections between the aesthetics and the ethics, just as it relates to like a climate crisis.
Yeah.
And what like a poem is good for or can do now. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and I'm interested. I actually don't think that the only mode, or even the most interesting one for that, is like elegies to nature, because we're not there yet, and so I've been playing around with just how different modes can respond and feel useful right now. So ekphrastic, or really just like witnessing documentation, odes, that was one of the Pablo Neruda poems right now that I mentioned, and also like instructional poems. Like I think a lot about poetry, of course, was an oral form before it was written, and was used a lot for like passing on information and instructions and things that you needed to remember. And so in the sort of like pre-apocalyptic or apocalyptic, or like wherever we are in that, I'm kind of like, how can poetry like help us now, right? Like what is like a poem that I would want to like have memorized, like to like go into like this unknown future of climate crisis, or what information, or I have like so many tabs bookmarked. Like what if, like how that's all just like in this, like it all feels quite fragile.
Yeah.
And so I've been interested about like poetry as a way to know a thing by heart going into this unknown future. So yeah, the nature, there's many parts of it, and it's all just, it's like, I feel like it's the stew that I'm in as a poet, but it is, it's evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's interesting too, because I feel like it's almost also like a documentation of how it is now before it gets, it seems like it will get worse.
Right.
Hopefully it won't, but,
Right.
So it's almost like preserving in a way.
Yeah, and I find C.A. Conrad so inspiring in this way of like, I feel like his work around this is really what made me first aware of all of the sounds that are disappearing as different species go extinct. Mm-hmm. And just the possibilities that creates, and also I think responsibilities to be as precise as we can, like to name the specific bird in the poem, like it matters, these things. And I think about what Gertrude Stein said about how it's easy to be ahead of one's time and more challenging to be like exactly in one's time. And so that it kind of shapes what I'm not interested in like writing elegies to things that are still here, but actually like writing odes to them, and just still being present with them.
Yeah. I like that. And okay, so like we'll change our subject a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Reading your 3 collections, it's clear that they are kind of like all in conversation with each other. Like there's instances where like lines become titles, and then like there's an image of like the dancing in a blue dress that happens a lot. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see them like kind of woven or connected together and within and across your collections.
Yeah, certainly, and also that exact question, I feel like I learn the most about it from other people. And, that's, like, funny how that happens, where to you something can feel either so scattered or like you've just written the same book again. And often I'm so grateful for other people, like the ways that they see connections or trajectories. It's interesting to have, so The Gospel According to X, which just came out, the chapbook, I actually wrote it right after The Spectral Wilderness came out. So it has been maybe 4 years at this point, and Writing Advantages of Being Evergreen, which came out a few months ago, came later. And, well, that's fun. All right.
Okay.
And I mean, what I mentioned a few minutes ago about like trying to get more intentional about the relationship between the aesthetics and the ethics, that's something that's on my mind. And that feels like a marked change from certainly The Spectral Wilderness, where ethics on a kind of interpersonal level, like relational level, was certainly on my mind as I was writing, but not really wider than that. And with Advantages of Being Evergreen, I felt just sort of thinking in different ways about the communal. And also, I started that book really in kind of the immediate weeks after the 2016 election, which just felt like, I mean, there are certain ways that we can like force or nurture our own trajectory as a writer, and then there are other things that just happen externally.
Yeah. And
really the election was sort of the main one, but leading up to that, and my poem in the book, Ghost Ship Novena Inside a Year-Long Funeral, kind of refers to like this pile-up events that was like Pulse Orlando, the Ghost Ship fire, the election, and all of these things that felt like they were sort of like threats to like safety and creative sanctuaries that my communities and people like my communities had built. So there were just different sort of circumstances on my mind when I wrote that book, and that is sort of continuing on with the things I'm working on now. I mean, not exactly in the same way, but I feel like I'm writing more in conversation with this climate stuff, and with like the total like just unknown of like where humans are in our lifespan of existence, in our time that we have on this planet. So that I think is a little bit of like what my sense is of the trajectory. And I you know, when I wrote The Spectral Wilderness, I was so in the thick of really like my first few years of like physical transition with hormones. And I feel at times like I was writing, I mean, I'm so glad I wrote those poems when I did, because they're, you know, I think sometimes that wisdom only accumulates, and it doesn't. We totally forget things when we get just further away from them or we're not immediately in it. And so I feel grateful that I wrote that book sort of from that moment, because there are things about the immediacy of that transition that I feel like I take for granted now or just don't really have access to anymore. So, yeah, I don't know if the trajectory is even, I mean, hopefully there are some things about it that the books can build on. But the books also hold things I feel that I don't really anymore, so.
Well, yeah, I feel like that kind of goes back to like talking about like documenting or preserving nature, and it's kind of like the documenting, preserving like bodies and time, but the times our bodies have been in. I don't know if that makes sense. But
yeah, totally. And I mean, gosh, I wish that I had written down like so much more then, you know, and so all I can do is do that now, even though it's, about different things, you know.
Yeah, I know, because I transitioned as well, and so like I remember I did videos for a while, and then I just stopped doing it, so like now I just lost that, so I'm like, it's kind of a similar thing.
Absolutely is. Yeah.
But
yeah.
What can you do?
Yeah. I know. Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, I was like, I have to think about other things, and I was grateful for that, you know? Like, it needed to, like, how to be both present for a thing and document it adequately and just show up for the rest of your life. You know, I don't know that we can do all of that at the same time, and so it's, it is what it is, but, yeah.
It kind of goes back to the other, like, the Gertrude Stein quote you said of, like, you're always ahead of your time, not in the present.
Yeah, so that is the harder to be, like, in your time. Yeah.
Especially, with, like, transition stuff, too, because it's just, like, at least for me, I was, like, so, like, I want it to be, like, 2 years in the future, right now. Like, I don't want to go through the interim time. So.
This is really, I mean, one thing that I have been interested in recently, both in Advantages of Being Evergreen and in newer work that I'm working on since then, is pleasure, the relationship between pleasure and desire, and how to actually be, I'm at this point, my second book just came out, I got this tenure track job, a lot of things that were sort of, for a while, on the horizon are now, like, here, or have happened, or, right? And noticing within myself how quickly things move to, like, okay, what's next, right? Like, tenure in 6 years, like, what's, like, the next book? And I've really become interested in, like, language as a house that I can build to just be inside pleasure, without sort of immediately looping to, like, the next desire. So Brian Tier has a great piece on the Poetry Foundation website called Textual Preference, and it's about the pleasures of reading. That's really great. And Adrienne Marie Brown's new book, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good. Those are a couple things that I've been sort of, like, speaking to and feeding into this for me recently. But yeah.
Those sound good. I'm gonna take note of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and I guess kind of going off of that a little bit, it's clear that, like, your work is also in conversation with, like, queer theory and queer histories, like, either explicitly, like, this is, like, after Judith Butler, like, the histories of different, mention different, like, people and time. But I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about the process of, like, accessing those histories, specifically those that have been poorly or inaccurately documented, or something along those lines.
Gosh, yeah. So, where to start? I was a women's studies minor in college. It was then women's studies. It is now University of Iowa has since renamed it, as many programs have, as women, gender, sexuality, or some order of those three words. And so I took feminist theory. I took a class that I don't actually think was in that department on queer media representation. And those courses kind of started to lay some groundwork, but really since then, trying to learn about these histories of what I call my queer side, has not been an academic pursuit. One thing that got me interested in librarianship actually was learning about this project in Milwaukee called the Queer Zine Archive Project, where it's like run out of some guy's house maybe, like so many amazing of these things are, and they're collecting, like a trove, an archive of queer zines, and also digitizing them on this website. And I found that really inspiring, and just kind of been cobbling pieces of it together since then. You know, watching United in Anger, learning about ACT UP. You know, we have to teach ourselves so many of these things, and really, actually, that's not even quite right. Like teaching each other or learning together, and the Zine Archive project, the Queer Zine Archive project in particular, excited me because I mean, like, the beauty of a zine, right? Anyone can make one. Like, they're all about economy and simplicity, and as a way to publish and circulate, as really like. Has historically been like a more accessible path, and I feel that like so much of queer history must be in zines, and there's others like, you know, Rain Arroyo as a writer who has become really important to me, who I only sort of learned about his work, you know, years after his death, and so that has been like working my way through his poetry and like what I can learn of his life, and I think of him and Linda as sort of like, I don't know what they occupy sort of just special positions for me, and yeah, the piece that you said about histories that have been sort of underdocumented, I think that you know, it is a history that has been marked by loss, you know, like almost a complete entire generation of gay men. And, you know, people that are in, whether it's like their obituary or a book that is written about their work, you know, sort of put back in the closet. So I try when I teach also just to, you know, I think of Langston Hughes as someone who is not always like remembered as like part of the like queer community. So when I teach, I try to just flag these in certain ways so that, like, I mean, all we have is sort of like these little signals that we give each other into the future of like queer was here. And so I think there's like kind of a responsibility to just make that visible as much as possible, because I don't think anyone else is going to do it for us.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, my syllabus this semester is I'm teaching almost all queer people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you tell your students that, or do you just sort of like let the work stand on its own? Like, I do it both ways sometimes, depending on.
Yeah, I mean, with some it was obvious. Like, I taught the anthology, the Nepantla anthology. Was it Queer Poets of Color?
Yeah.
So like that one was obvious, and the other ones wasn't so obvious. But
right.
Like, someone actually complained about my syllabus. So what can you do? But yeah, you're right. Yeah. Like, no one's gonna. It always falls on like on the minority person or like whatever to do the teaching, and it becomes a responsibility.
Yeah.
It's not right.
Yeah.
But.
And I think, and what I find so amazing also is like, you know, queerness, as far as we know, isn't like passed on genetically, and yet it finds its way into the future, into the present in these most amazing ways. Like, it is just here every single time, and is not something that, like, in most cases, someone, you know, gets from their parents. And I love that about it. I think it is so miraculous and beautiful. Maybe that's off the topic. I don't know.
I mean, that's great.
Apropos of everything, kind of. Yeah.
I guess this is also kind of related. So I want to also talk about pronouns, like throughout like all of your work. Because I really resonated with like the he, the me, him, he versus like the she, her, like as in like a trans dialogue of like past self or something like that. Like, but then there's also other instances where it's like it seems fairly clear that it's another person, like a partner or something. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe like the intention there, like the ambiguity, maybe there between the or if maybe I read it wrong. I don't know.
No, it's. I mean, you're not the first person who has picked up on that ambiguity. And as for intention, I'd rather not lie and say that it was intentional. Let me peel back some of those double negatives. I'm not sure that it was intentional, and yet you're right that it's there. And partly, there are poems that are sort of drawing from like an externalized relational pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
And then in other places that's referring sort of to parts of self or pieces of self throughout history. And I'm totally fine and interested in what happens with those two sort of contexts rubbing up against one another. And to me, it's not important that, a reader knows when the she is someone else and when it's sort of getting at something about the historical description or remembrance of self. And I think also, there's, we do try to find, I think, pieces of ourselves in others, sometimes in generative ways and other times in, subconscious or projection ways. And so I feel like that ambiguity, there's it makes sense, there's truth to it, and it isn't really something that I did intentionally. Although I think in Field Guide, the first poem of Advantages of Being Evergreen, there were ways that I was intentional about the kind of the anaphora, the repeated elements throughout the poem that I kind of knew that I was cultivating that ambiguity. So that poem stands out in that. And with X, in the Gospel According to X, X started out as like a placeholder for what I thought would later become a name, and then it became very clear to me that the placeholder was sort of the point, this gesture of a sort of ambiguous symbol, piece of a formula that holds space that can become something else that maybe isn't yet but also already is. And that too is something that I picked up in Linda Berry's workshop, where we were writing exercises of just using X as a way as a placeholder for maintaining speed while writing, with the intention of coming back to it later. And I just didn't in that project. And I just realized at some point that it was just X. Yeah.
That's so interesting. When I first read it, I was thinking of because now in some states you can get X as your gender marker on your ID.
Yeah, I don't even think I was aware of that at the time. But
well, I don't know if it was written so soon after Spectral Witness. I don't know if that was a thing then.
Yeah, maybe it was just starting to become a thing, but it certainly wasn't on my radar. But I mean, it's funny why I mean, it makes sense, right? But yeah, why X as this queer letter? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. You said something, I was going to say something and I totally forgot. But it was about intention with the pronouns. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Okay, sure. X.
X, yeah. Okay, so I also want to talk about home.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept of home, and throughout history, I feel like home is complicated enough as it is, just everyday, everyday people. But I feel like with specifically with queer people, I think it's always a loaded term, and I just wanted to talk about how in a lot of the times the speakers in your poem are mourning a loss of familiarity and a loss of home, and also creating space. And I was wondering if you view home as a place that exists already, or a place that we have to create for ourselves, and maybe even within ourselves. Or talk about home.
Yeah, great question. I do still think of Iowa as a kind of home. but maybe a little bit in the way that, like, you misremember a song, you know, but then the version that you misremember it as also becomes true, kind of. Like, when I think of Iowa as home, I don't know that there's a physical place, really, that matches that I could go back to. My parents have since moved. You know, other relatives have passed and are underground there. I do still have some in Iowa, and it has been nice to go back and spend time with them there, but you know, I think it is particular for queer people, and I mean, we know that it is. We know that vastly disproportionate amounts of youth experiencing homelessness are from the LGBT community. Going back to, you know, what I mentioned about queer and trans experience most often being something that is not shared with someone's, you know, family that they were raised with. And so, you know, for the, like, I mean, kids getting, like, rejected by their families, kicked out of their homes, and so, and, you know, you can go as far as, like, the basic needs. I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they say that you can go 3 hours without shelter, which might sound like you could go way longer than that, but when you picture, like, a snowstorm or, like, 120-degree heat or whatever, all of these extremes that are becoming more common with climate change. So this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, just shelter and queer people, and how, you know, for me it has been this sort of, like, it's a bit, you know, there's, like, wonderings about home or longings for home, chosen family, trying to cultivate what this is as an adult. And I'd like, you know, just as like I was mentioning, I feel like I, like, have these things now that were on the horizon for me for a while, and I'm trying to figure out how to show up more for people for whom home isn't really, like, you know, this like a metaphorical question in the ways that I feel like I get to wonder about it today, but is, like, something much more, like, immediate. There's these great guides now online that are geared toward, like, helping shelters transition from, like, sort of not doing anything special geared toward, like, being LGBTQ friendly to like, really knowing what the particular needs are and accommodating them. So I feel inspired by that, and I feel like hopefully things are moving in a good direction, but
we kind of already talked about this with a little bit of nature, and then also talking about, like, transformations, and I think with that, but so I'll just So nature, specifically the volatile ways in which she grows and transforms in order to survive, is, like, prevalent throughout all your work that I've read. The speaker in The Spectral Wilderness at one point says, "I farm not for the countryside, but for the tumbling sense inside me that everything has to transform eventually." With these thoughts in mind, how do you see these transformations as creating spaces within which the queer body can both live and survive, which is kind of also touches on what we were just talking about. But
can you say that one more time?
Sorry.
That's okay.
How do you see these transformations as creating space or spaces within which the queer body can both live and survive? Like the transformations of nature and stuff. Maybe I'm not being clear enough.
No, that's okay. I mean, I'll just say some things and you can let me know afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, adaptation is a lot of what was on my mind, with advantages being evergreen. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, this question of going back to, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which has, like, the physiological needs on the bottom food, water, shelter, air. And then all the way at the top is like art and self-expression. And my partner actually was just telling me that those, what was it? It was like, debunked is maybe a strong word, but it's a false idea that one moves through those linearly, as though art only becomes important like after all of these things, right? When for me it's like there's this matrix of needs sort of happening all at once. And I'm not saying that I would die in 3 minutes or 3 hours without poetry, but like 3 weeks would be pushing it. And so when I think about adaptation, I feel excited about, I mean, our planet is obviously changing, and I feel like that only presses up against what are already urgent needs. And I think at the same time that surviving is important and great and hard work many days. And also, like, who doesn't want to thrive on top of that? And so a lot of what I was thinking about with the advantages of being evergreen was sort of these like slices of like pleasure and paradise and beauty alongside everything else, alongside like navigating threats and dangers. And it's a kind of line being walked between what I feel like is an important sense of belonging with the earth, like the earth, especially for people who have been made to feel like we don't belong everywhere, or if we have been alienated from our families, like where did we come from? Who did we belong to, right? So I think it can be very powerful to say, like, we belong to the earth, right? Like, we are here, and it is our home just as much as it is for anyone else. And at the same time, it seems like it's that exact attitude from humans that have sort of gotten us to this place of just, like, I know that that's really different from this sort of extractive sense of entitlement that has precipitated this human impact on the climate. And at the same time, it's a little crunchy there. And that's like a question that I'm interested in my work. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
No, totally.
Okay.
Yeah. I've actually never thought about that like that. Because like I feel as like personally, but then also like with like when I read your work too, like of like this connection to nature and to like that we all are the same particles, like we're all mixed up at one point.
Right.
But like thinking about that, that's what got us in this mess in the first place.
So... Or maybe it's the difference between, you know, the feeling like I belong to the earth versus like it belongs to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's actually funny. Okay, so when I originally wrote that question, I had live and thrive, but then I read an interview that you were in with Kava Akbar a couple years ago, and you said, I've been trying to think of a word that I hate less than thrive. I'm still searching for a better word to describe going beyond surviving.
Oh, that's funny.
And so now I'm curious if you still feel the same, or if you found a word that's better, or if it's just totally not even on your mind anymore.
Well, that's funny. Thank you for reminding me of that. I do not feel a strong aversion to thrive currently, but I think what I was saying about pleasure has taken some of the place of that, like acknowledging its role as something important that like keeps us going, and that like we can't just work all the time. Like, there has to be pleasure, and it can be part of the work. We can't just organize all the time. There has to be pleasure, and it can be part of the organizing. So, yeah, I think I would locate some of it there now. And I also, yeah, I think the way that I feel about, that I apparently felt about Thrive in the Dive Dapper interview, I would locate it back now with the word tolerate. That one to me is like, it's not enough. When I read about, ways organizations are trying to become more tolerant or how to show that you're tolerant, I'm just like, yeah, that one is insufficient for me. We tolerate things that ultimately are still unpleasant and that we wish we didn't have to. And so, yeah, I'm much more interested in places becoming affirming or, any other sort of number of these things. So I'd like to move my aversion to the word tolerance in this interview for some interviewer in the future to check back with me on.
That's so funny. Cycle. Yeah. So it's kind of going off in a different direction. I tried to look online to find information about this. I couldn't really find a whole lot. But I know that you read at the trans community briefing in the White House in 2016.
I
did. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, about that, how it was, experience. Because Obama was still in office, but then it was just after,
barely.
After the election. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting time to be there.
Yeah, it was a then annual trans community briefing. It was annual at the time, and definitely has not happened since then. And briefing. I'm not sure how many other briefings at the White House look like this, because it was more like how to describe it? A celebration, a variety show, a salon. It was just kind of like an amazing cross-section of 60 or so presenters talking about their work, or I read a few poems. Some people were talking about their activism. There were other poets. I don't even remember what else. It was a beautiful, just sort of conglomeration of things, mostly trans people of color. And I almost didn't go. And I didn't realize that until just now when you asked me about it. I totally almost didn't go. And I remember talking to a friend who was like, you should definitely go to that. You should definitely go. And I don't know why. It was something that seemed so all-consuming at the time, I was nervous, you know? I think I was, quite nervous. And it was, a big deal. I'm pretty sure I wore a tie, and, we had to go through the whole sort of elaborate security process to get in, which was actually a process that started weeks before that, where I had to send the text ahead of time of poems that I planned to read. Wow. And I'm pretty sure there was a background check weeks ahead of time. So I almost didn't go. I think I just kind of psyched myself out, or I don't know. It felt, I don't even remember why, but I'm really glad I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel I don't know, that must have been, I don't know, so wild to be in the White House and then just be celebrating that. That would be great.
It was a good time.
Yeah, but I feel with that kind of stuff, it's maybe sometimes it's the things you're most apprehensive about. Because you're apprehensive, maybe the fact that it turns out so well, or that it goes well, it's makes the contrast makes it into something. Not saying that it wouldn't have already been something great, but
yeah, absolutely. And I think, I feel it does work that way, and it's I think harder to see things work that way in my own life, and easy for me to see. For example, with my students, it is often when they are on the edge of something amazing that they'll get freaked out, or want to put down a particular draft, or anything like that. And so I hope that we all just keep going. Mm-hmm. It's a particular kind of intuition that I think can sometimes, there's other kinds of intuition when you feel like freaked out about something that it's like, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. But there is a particular kind that's like, this is an amazing opportunity, or I'm really close to some kind of like breakthrough or something amazing, and I totally want to walk away from it.
Yeah.
And hopefully I get better through at recognizing that, but I don't. It's kind of ongoing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I feel like I get that sometimes. I feel like with probably lots of writers where it's like, especially if you're writing about something that's like hard to write about or traumatic, it's like, I know that writing it, I'll feel better and it'll get it out, but then the process of getting there is so hard. So.
Yeah, and I have read, several interviews recently, or even just writers, posting on Twitter who have had memoirs come out recently. Saeed Jones, one I can think of, who described the process as terrible. Like, not sort of pleasurably cathartic at all, but actually, like, quite awful. And I've been kind of interested in that. Yeah. And I think, have people, like, always felt that way about writing memoirs and just haven't said so? Yeah. Or, like, yeah, I don't know. That's totally a tangent, but I found it interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm out of my printed questions, but I think we still have some time. We can spend more time just talking about your chapbook.
Sure.
I feel like, it's obviously called The Gospel According to Acts, so
yeah.
The gospel, has religious connotations, yeah. But then maybe was wondering if you could, like, talk more about that process and like, the way you use, like, spirituality in this chapbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's kind of a vague question, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I was actually thinking about this on my drive down here. I went to Catholic school from 2nd to 8th grade. And I was not Catholic. My mom was raised Catholic, but we didn't, like, go to a parish in town. And so my experience at Catholic school was I was one of, like, 4 kids at the school who wasn't Catholic. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of, like, in it, but also observing it. Mm-hmm. And so, I think it was once a week, they would bring in 4 priests, one from each parish in town, and each one would set up in a different corner of the gymnasium. And the entire school population would go to the gymnasium, and all of my friends would be, like, lining up for, like, their priest to, do their weekly confession, and me and, like, these 3 other kids would just be sitting on the bleachers, talking. And so, which just seemed normal at the time, and now when I think about it, I was like, it's kind of odd. It's a little odd. I don't know what else we would have done during that time. There were so few of us who weren't, like, going through the active confession. But, so I feel like, I was sort of, like, during what was an impressionable time, this kind of, like, act of confession, the impulse toward it, and then the act. It was just kind of, like in there, and it's something that I've carried with me, and that also kind of had a layer added onto it where I feel that, queer and trans people, there is this whole thing about, like, coming out. It can be amazing, of course, and also at times it is sort of like something that is owed to other people, or, trans people experience violence for not, like, disclosing their trans status to, like, a potential date soon enough according to who. Yep. So these things around confession, and there's a few lines in there that are kind of about that in particular, but I was also interested, I felt really prepared for, like, the physical aspects of transition. Very prepared. Like, I had got, like, handouts from my doctor, and read, like, everything that I could on the internet. And for the more spiritual aspects of it, I felt very unprepared. And in a way that was sort of it kind of freaked me out, because I do think it is holy and beautiful, and in part was just kind of trying to write the type of thing that I wished that I could read about it. Mm-hmm. And I think, confession, prayer, there's the impulse of them, there's the act of them, there's also, like, is there someone on the other side of it? And transition to Me Too seems like an act of faith, like something that you might not know exactly how it is going to work out, but it's still important to you to do it, and like you believe that it matters, and so all of those things were just sort of blurring together for me at this particular point, which was still somewhat early in my transition, and the particular relationship that I had been writing about in the Spectral Wilderness with these questions of sort of like how much change can love handle had, been answered in kind of particular ways. And so it was a hard time, and all of these things were kind of kicking around. And I wrote that I drafted that in one weekend. It was a very intense weekend. And I was living in a house that I now in retrospect understand was totally a haunted house. It had this blocked off attic and was right on some train tracks. But at the time I was like, oh, this is a cute rental bungalow. But I felt that I was the one who was haunted also. And I don't know to what extent that comes through in there. But yeah, so all of these kinds of things of just kind of navigating the becoming and integrating and walking with total fear about actually will I is this all at the expense of a life that will be alone? So
yeah, wow. That's serious though. Yeah.
So it's very it's deeply meaningful to me. At a certain point I wasn't sure whether it would be published anywhere. At first I had it sort of bundled just as a section with some other poems, and I was thinking of it as an actual book-length manuscript, and I had sent that out a few places. It was a finalist at Nightboat, who had said, we love this, but it's not done. It's not in its final form. And they were right. They were totally right. And over the next few years, I had it just in the drawer for a while, and then I ultimately just stripped everything out of all the other poems that I had in there, aside from this. So it's kind of wild to me to see it in person now. I just got the boxes this past week, and yeah, it's a trip.
Yeah. It's actually funny that you said that it was a haunted house, because there's a poem in here that's...
Yeah, that was one that I had originally had in the full length with this.
Oh, wow.
That's the only one, I think, of those that I pulled forward from that, and I put it in here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that inspired by that house you lived in? Or do you think it was...
Yes. It wasn't so specific to that, but that was certainly part of it. Yeah, for sure. I mean, everything that I just described, yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that, when you were writing this, Advantage of Being Evergreen, you were thinking more of, pleasure and, community and just being together.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, or...
Yeah, I think I am learning, the older I get, that there is really kind of so little that we have to do alone. And I feel like I have gotten really used to, I mentioned I was a lonely kid. I was, to a certain extent, was just life is lonely. And it is a little bit, but it also totally isn't. It doesn't have to be. And there's ways to make it that are much more together than I think the modern world has designed it. Don't really feel like we're supposed to live alone, and I've lived alone before, and it felt great at the time, and also terrible. So I'm just becoming more interested in people and what we can do for each other, what we can do together, what we owe each other, and just that life to me is better that way. And I think particularly in that time of right after the election, it was critical for me to just remember that even though I felt very alone and freaked out, I wasn't. It didn't have to be. And so particularly the poem in the river I dream about is really like, to me, like the one where I'm like, oh, finally, like everyone that I love is in one place. Because also like I feel like my heart is just sort of scattered everywhere, and these people that, you know, are really dear to me and just live in many different places at this point. And so at least in that poem, I feel like everyone is there, and it's really nice.
That's so beautiful. I feel like there was another thing I was going to ask and I just forgot it again. I can't tell what time it is. Do you know what time it is?
4:27.
Oh.
If I'm reading that right.
So I mean, we're pretty much close there. Was there anything maybe else that you wanted to talk about at all with in relation to your work, or?
I don't think so. Your questions were great. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and I can't think of anything else that I would want to bring up. So just, yeah, it's been really nice to talk with you more. And I was a little nervous going into this.
Oh, me too. I specifically wore a shirt that you couldn't tell any sweat was happening.
Yeah, no, just thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of this, the Oral Histories Project.
Yeah.